This is Dan Schneider, and on this edition of the Dan Schneider video interview, I am doing another in my continuing series of what I'm calling the George Dickerson Project, about the life, the career of the American actor, writer, poet, George Dickerson, who died earlier this year. My guest that you see before is Dejan Georgevich, and he in the film industry, and he will give his memories on George Dickerson. Well, I want to welcome Dejan Georgevich, and Dejan has agreed to give his memories of George Dickerson, and he's going to kick it off by reading something they read from George's memorial. But before you do that, Dejan, let me just ask if you could just give a minute or two background of who you are, how you met George Dickerson, and what you were involved with him before you do your reading.
I'm for the last 35 years, I've been a cinematographer, director. I most recently, actually the last 20 years in television episodic shows and movies. Going back to how I met George, we go back to 38 years ago, 1977, when I was a graduate student at NYU Film School. And I was preparing for my thesis project, which I chose to be a John Cheever story, which was, oh my God, here is the most a wonderful American author. And I contacted him, and he gave me permission to adapt his story, The 548. And it was during the casting that I met George, who recently just came back from Beirut, having served there as a diplomat with the United Nations, with UNRWA. And immediately saw this the right person to play the lead in my film, which I renamed, called The Commuter. I had non-commercial permission from John Cheever, the author, to adapt the short story. So it's a friendship that has gone on for 38 years, like I said. And with that film, George went on to Los Angeles, and he secured a part on Hill Street Blues. And of course, that led up to, of course, Blue Velvet eventually. I think which number up to 20 feature films that he's acted in, and of course that led to his being nominated into the Academy of Motion Pictures.
Okay. Well, as I said, George died earlier this year in January, and I think it was about 2 months later in March, I believe, was the memorial. And you said that you had, in order to facilitate the interview, you were going to read either part or all of what you had read there. So please go ahead.
Okay. As we say in the film business, and for that matter in life, you only get to know someone after spending a lot of time together in the trenches. I've known George for 38 years. I met him literally not too long after his return to the States, after his surviving the ravages of the Lebanese Civil War, which he confessed scorched whatever was left of his poetic psyche. He was in his early 40s, and just to be able to do something productive and creative, he decided to become an actor. In 1977, I directed him in my award-winning NYU graduate thesis film, The Commuter, adapted from a John Cheever short story, The 548. For the past 7 years and up until a few months ago, we've been collaborating, George as writer and me as director, and co-producing his screenplay, The Fool's Errand, based on his real-life experiences during the 1974-75 Lebanese Civil War, and his short story first published in Penthouse, The Man Who Loved Butterflies. George worked tirelessly under tremendous physical pain and even mental anguish, writing numerous rewrites of The Fool's Errand while often under heavy medication. I like to believe writing the screenplay gave him a meaningful purpose and more of a reason to live these past 7 years. It was a memorable, creative collaboration that made me all the richer having him as my friend. Just like two ex-athletes, which we were many moons ago, we certainly challenged each other and had our disagreements. However, it always ended up bringing out our best. We never took offense, but always worked in pursuit of understanding and reaching for excellence. In other words, we wouldn't allow any room for bullshit or false notes. Ours was a mutual sharing of respect to the currency of ideas, combined with a love for truth and beauty. It's very difficult for me to step back today and try to best describe a complex personality that was George. Just as he could be eloquent, charming, and sensitive, he could also be a scathingly critical insomniac, difficult, stubborn, grumpy, control freak micromanager, and a chain-smoking paranoid beast. And yet, you wouldn't find a more loyal and dearest friend who spoke and lived his truth, revealing a big heart and love of humanity. He's the man you want on your team and who wasn't afraid to stand up and fight against injustice, unkindness, and all sorts of evil. In some ways, he reminds me of the Byzantine icon of St. George slaying the dragon that hangs above my home study desk. A gallant knight-errant indeed. This is the same man who stood up and blackmailed the big Lebanese gunman, Gemayel, to save lives, and it worked. He survived that strange mixture of everyday life and death, nightmarish in its psychological effects. I believe that true friendship is like a lighthouse, a constant beacon of light guiding us safely back to harbor, especially when choppy waters, dark clouds, high winds threaten something much worse. Over the years, we certainly covered each other's back during both bad times. I think it appropriate to offer parts of a mosaic that pieced together provides an impressionistic portrait of George. 1, never attempt to call George whenever there was a Yankee or Giants game going on. You risked his wrath. 2, never schedule a meeting or discuss business on the 13th of the month. Yes, he was superstitious. 3, never totally believe what you read in the newspaper or hear in the news, because more often than not, he would say the opposite of the information is the truer story. 4, best time to have a phone conversation was between the hours of midnight and 3 a.m. George kept vampire hours, thanks to the Lebanese Civil War, when most of the severest fighting occurred at night. 5, his favorite candy bar, Three Musketeers chocolate bar, if you're lucky to still find it, to be enjoyed with a can of Pepsi on a sunny late afternoon in Washington Square Park, preferably a few steps away from Giuseppe Garibaldi's statue. 6, make sure that owner chef Abigail Hitchcock keeps our table free for our late afternoon meetings at Camage Bistro on McDougal Street. George's order was very simple: black coffee, and at least 7. George didn't suffer fools lightly. In fact, he had a photographic memory and would remember exactly to the word what was discussed in conversation. You better be on your best game. I'm not the only one believing that his climbing up all 72 steps to his 5th floor Bleecker Street apartment extended his life quite a few more years. Allow me to share the following email quote just a few months ago that best illustrates his strong-willed determination and love of life. This past Thursday, I scared all the doctors and nurses by proving I could climb all the 72 steps. I will need to climb to go home to my tenement walk-up apartment. I hope they will unchain this Frankenstein's monster this coming Tuesday, September 23rd, so I can roar out into daylight with my foot and soul intact. And maybe, just maybe, I can whoop it up in the autumn I love so much. George would be a shoo-in on the A&E hit reality show, Hoarders. His proclivity for saving every piece of paper turned his apartment to a Grand Canyon of paper and printed words. George insisted that he knew where everything was stored. In other words, he invented his own Dewey system. Never count George out. His will to live redefined the expression, a cat of 9 lives. Hell no, that's not enough. This cool cat made it to 12 lives, skipped the number 13, and he was determined to try for 14 lives. To quote him, he says, I almost died on the 27th. Then with darkness all around me, my wife stuck some mango ice in my mouth for me to suck on. I remember thinking this is too wonderful to leave, and so I fought it out and came back from nowhere. It wasn't uncommon over the past 5 years that George would suddenly take a beat and spin off topic with a desultory remark. He would look to me and say, you must know I don't have much more time left. To which I would acknowledge saying, yeah, George, I understand. Some of us just have more of a head start, that's all. Of course, I understood the other import of his statement. Get the Fool's Errand script produced already. George was adamant about not using the 4-letter word beginning with F in the Fool's Errand screenplay. He did his best to avoid using what he did his best to avoid using what for some of us is normal quotidian expression, fuck you. He believed it was too easy, lazy, and sloppy use of language to define one's character. He wrote The Fool's Errand screenplay while listening and being inspired to the soundtrack to The English Patient, composed by the brilliant and talented French-Lebanese Oscar award-winning composer Gabriel Yared. One of the last emails that George shared with me was a comment he made to a LA film producer via email saying, "I'm still in the hospital dreaming of lighthouses, like lonely outposts beckoning into the mist of the future. Know, dear friend, that you've reached a safe port of call surrounded by those who love you. Suzanne, Errand, Dome, Sam, Lisa, and Rachel. You have a remarkable and beautiful family as well as outstanding friends holding ship's anchor with you." One of the last emails I received from George was, "Dear Dejan, thanks for having been my friend." I wrote back, "Your friend yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Thank you, my dear friend."
Well, thanks for sharing that, Dejan. I was just thinking the last time I actually spoke with George, probably about 11 months ago, I think it was in August, I had been off 2 or 3 times a year for about a dozen years, since about 03 or 02, when he first contacted me, because I had written an article about, well, no, he had contacted me about my website, early internet radio show. But just let me start off. Tell me about the last time that you saw George. Or was it within the last month or two of his life? I remember his voice was quite weak, and I remember now saying to my wife back even last August, I think that's probably going to be the last time I'm going to speak to George.
I saw George the night before he passed away in hospice. He was at Bellevue in the hospice ward, and it was very surreal for me because, just as a side note, I was experiencing my grandson's fight for cancer. He's just turned 2 years old. He's a twin, and he was on the 9th floor, and George was on the 17th floor. So I was visiting George quite regularly during the last year, especially when he was in either an assisted living facility or at the hospital.
Let me just talk a bit about the screenplay, The Fool's Errand. I remember I read it in 2009. George had sent me it, and I know it was constantly being revised, so it probably went through maybe 3 or 4 more revisions over the years before whatever it is now, or his last final version. When I spoke with Richard Hobby, who's been trying to get it produced for a number of years, he had told me that he had who had other contacts last 5 or 10 years about the screenplay, and some anecdotes about trying to get a producer. I know George was adamant to not get the money people of Hollywood involved because they would, inevitably try to Hollywood ending it up kind of thing. So just speak a little bit, if you have 1 or 2 anecdotes about trying to get the film made.
Well, as a matter of fact, just on your last point there, George had me connect with a Hollywood producer that he worked with 15 years ago, Jeffrey Clifford, who's president of Heyman Films. They're best noted for their Harry Potter series. And Jeffrey Clifford is a big fan of George's work. And he's still currently in the position trying to help me get to A-list actors, because we realize we need a prominent actor who's going to be in every scene to get this screenplay realized. Now, through Richard Hobby and his connections, we were in contact with Ramez Tomei from Scheherazade Films, and they produced over 12 feature films, including Woody Harrelson's The Messenger and a few other of his films. We are now listed in development with Scheherazade Films, projected for 2017. But it's been a lot of it's a balancing act, because what Scheherazade can produce is eventually a good part of the financing, but it's all contingent on getting that A-list actor. And so that's where Jeffrey Clifford comes in to try. He's our conduit, person to help us get to that A-list actor through these agents in LA. And I got to tell you, it's an exhausting process, because a lot of people, it just takes time. I think an anecdote that Jeffrey said, listen, for anyone to read a script in this town, it takes at least 3 months or more before you get. So it's now prior to this, yes, we had some close calls with some independent investors in Michigan. Actually, we're of Lebanese American descent who liked the script. At least their representative loved the script very much, and they. What I was told, actually, they own a lot of the real estate and corporate real estate in that area. But that took about 2 years away from our efforts because it was back and forth, a lot of smoke and mirrors, and eventually they had put money in a film that. I'm trying to remember, didn't do well, and so then eventually they backed off from wanting to invest in any other films. So right now, in the current situation, I've looking at a scenario where we've got to get a prominent actor that will kick in the work of the support of Scheherazade. In the meantime, I've worked out the shooting schedule, the budget that incorporates shooting in Cyprus and also in Serbia. I'm also aware that Serbia, we would look into a combination of equity monies from Scheherazade and tax credits from Serbia, as well as pre-sales that's dependent on who our lead actor is. That's the reality. Yeah. So in some ways, yeah, we go back to, is it a Hollywood's it's a hybrid. You got to have the name to kick the project off, unless I go a route that I admire and envy my European colleagues who work within the film fund in Europe, where we would get a less known actor perhaps as the lead, and we could do it for a lot cheaper. So that's in a nutshell where we are at this point. But George and I created Juggler's Junction as co-producers of this. Richard Hobby is in contract with us as part of our team, and it's a long distance run. What can I say? The old adage is it's like giving birth to an elephant.
Yeah. He said that George always wanted you to direct the film. So just is it any easier, do you think? I mean, if there was someone like a Dino De Laurentiis still alive, I think he died some years back, would it be easier to get someone like him than a Hollywood person? And on the Hollywood side, I mean, how much, just explain a little bit about the mechanics of, let's say you got a George Clooney or a Brad Pitt kind of attached to a project. So the European, if you could explain that for like a layman.
Well, the emphasis right now is going after our lead person, and of course, when I speak to folks in Hollywood, let's talk to Bradley Cooper, let's talk to Christian Bale, let's talk to Jake Gyllenhaal, but he's a little young. But what George and I always had Viggo Mortensen as the lead person for this. Even though he's well into his 50s right now, I still feel he can play a little younger because ideally the character of Eric Johnson is in his early 40s. And of course, let me just get as far as preliminary cast suggestions here. I was thinking of Paul Giamatti. Philip Seymour Hoffman has passed. He would have made a perfect Jack, I thought. But I believe in strongly that Paul Giamatti would fulfill that role quite well. And yeah, it's as far as a European producer, right? That's a possibility, or it's a producer that I'm seeking through Scheherazade and through some other connections that we can work this out through Europe, which is why I chose Europe. I had filmed in when Serbia was Yugoslavia, part of Yugoslavia, back in the late 80s. I'm also good friends with their two leading directors there, Goran Paskalovic and Amir Kusturica. So I'm well aware of the cost advantages of shooting in Eastern Europe. And they're both, actually, those countries are competing with each other with tax credits as we speak. And I filmed, it's been a privilege as a cinematographer, director. I've filmed around the world many, many times. And had the opportunity to work with different producers and crews there. So, I mean, it's an ongoing process. You know, as far as where the final chemistry is going to come together, that's still what we're working on right now. I think the priority is getting that lead person, a lead commitment. And with that, I'm in meetings now with the casting director, and we're going through that. It just takes time. And so patience is emphasized here to get a response. Unfortunately, the actors I've worked with quite a few, like Richard Dreyfuss or anyway, Dreyfuss just comes to mind right now. Stanley Tucci's another. They aren't the right characters for this part, for this story, and it is an industry of relationships, and that's why we have good feedback and communication. I met with Jeffrey Clifford at Warner's lot last January. We had a very productive meeting. And it's basically he's making every effort to get in touch with the leading agencies to get the script to these A-list actors, and that's something that was the common theme with George and myself. And when I would be on the phone with him, he'd say, "Get the script to these actors. We got to get the script to these actors." So that's the priority right now.
Speaking of relationships, has George's son Dome Karakowski, who's a well-known Finnish filmmaker, has he been involved in anything? Has he given you any tips or leads of money people, or people in Europe to help get the production going?
Well, it's funny you should mention Dome. I've had we've struck up a friendship last year. I'm also a professor at the School of Visual Arts. I teach a master's class in cinematography, and the School of Visual Arts wanted me to vet 2 conservatories in Europe last year, and one was in Finland. And so that brought me together with Dome, although I had met him briefly here when he came to visit George a year before. But we struck up a very good friendship, and also I saw him this past February in Los Angeles because he's preparing a new movie. Hasn't really, no, I didn't really talk about the European method or what he can provide, although he was very supportive of me to direct the film. He feels it's a project that has to be made. But I understand he's in a different situation. I mean, he's now risen to be one of the top directors out of Finland. And what, again, I go back to what I said earlier, is that I envy my European director friends or filmmakers. They work under the film fund. They can make films for $3 to $5 million. They work it out by getting credits. If they shoot in Ireland, they'll get a little bit from Ireland. If they do the post in Germany, they'll get a little money from Germany. And if they do some other sound design in France, they'll get some money. That's the way they work. I know Goran, my Serbian director friend, he's made 16 feature films that way successfully. So that's you know, again, I admire that. It's an equation to look at if we were to go the European route. But I'm not. I'm an American, and the question is, you know, we don't have an entity that's a European entity. How to work that out, to work that equation, that's a possibility. But right now, if you look at the Sherazade management with Ramez, you can look at, as recently as a couple months ago, he asked me for a byline for the poster. And we have the Fool's Errand now. There's a poster, and there's also a byline on it. Listed as Sherazade, one of their 5 or 6 films in development right now.
Okay, well, let's end this segment with talking about the film, and let's take a little break. And in the next segment, we'll go back to the beginning, you know, your post, and you know, anything else that you've done with George over the years, and we'll do that in a moment. I want to now take a little step back and talk about with George on both a personal level as well as if you ever worked together with him. So you had mentioned that back in the 70s you had graduated, done a film adaptation with George acting in it.
Yes.
And so was that just the first of several collaborations? Or?
Well, that was the first collaboration that. You know, I cast him for that role in the 548 adaptation, John Cheever, and what I found, there was a scene there at the end of the short story where, let me back up, is the lead character is a cad, he's a womanizer, and he his character has this woman fired because after a one-night stand, and she pursues him through the streets of New York, and ultimately it resolves in a scene underneath a train tunnel between the north and southbound trains, and she confronts him she chases him through. She meets him at the. Let me back up. She chases him through the streets of New York, leading onto the. He thinks he successfully eluded her, and she ends up on the train with him, and he wants to leave, and then she puts a 38 to his ribs. George's performance in that last scene was stunning. And right then, I saw where the emotional memory, where the references came from, given the horrors that he experienced in Beirut. She has him at gunpoint, and then, of course, the story ends that she feels a lot better. Morally, she feels that it would be a waste to shoot him. She's a lot better than that. And as she leaves slowly through this underground tunnel to go to the southbound trains, George's character gets up and emits a primal scream, shouting out her name. It was so riveting. And again, I just, to myself, I understood it, didn't want to disturb him, where this was all coming from, but it certainly echoed many of the horrors and his last days of PTS, post-traumatic stress disorder. But that was the first, and then it evolved that we both had an interest in international relations. I was a double major in college in Russian studies and international relations. It wasn't until my senior year I decided to commit to filmmaking rather than going the route of diplomacy. So we had that common bond about being very interested in international politics, what's going on in the world. Also, we were big fans of Jean-Luc Carré, Graham Greene, and we shared our appreciation, for that genre of stories. And when it came to a few years ago, exactly 7 years ago, I approached George again, and I said, that story, The Man Who Loved Butterflies, has stayed with me for 20 years now. I really believe it could be expanded into a powerful film. He was reluctant at first. We would meet. He said, well, let's talk about it. We met at the Cafe Vivaldi a few times for about literally 3 months. And he said, take some notes. He said, Dejan, you got to understand, this is very painful for me to draw up many of these experiences from my life, what happened when I was in Beirut in 74, 75. Eventually, he said, okay, because I've been thinking about, I just started writing my novel about this based on a man who loved butterflies. But let's go ahead, let's do it. It's not going to be easy. So the first 3 months, he was amazing. First 3 months, every night at midnight, I would get a phone call with one scene written already. And I would give my notes. And after the first draft, believe it or not, I could see where the influence of the novel came through here. It was 200 pages. I said, George, we've got to trim this. We've got to take this down. And eventually, so my role was taking what was a short story, The Man Who Loved Butterflies, which is now about 9 pages in Act 3 of The Fool's Errand. And again, go through this editing and criticism process, which was back and forth, that went on for up until recently, where we changed the ending. I felt the ending was a bit manipulative and contrived. I felt there was greater honesty to have his son and Eric Johnson part in Beirut, with the idea that who's going to step up first and say, you're my son or you're my father. It's a different ending right now, which I think is far stronger, more honest. And I think it underscores Eric Johnson's character of seeking redemption through love with his family by returning to his family.
Um, I was going to ask actually about whether you and George ever exchanged notes about writing or film. Let me start on the George end because I know that he had a 2 decade or so writer's block, especially
Right.
with poetry. Did he ever talk to you about that? Did he ever send you any poems or anything other than the screenplay or the novel to look at?
No, of course, I've read his poems, and he didn't send me any new poems. The writer's block that he had for quite a few years following his time in Beirut. Um, I just wanted to share with you, there's something here. He said, please understand, it says here, I look I look forward to being able to work with you in the future and will be interested in your reaction to my Butterfly short story. This is after we first met. Please understand it was written in 1984, and as the first thing I was able to write after the war. It was an emotional outlet for not only my kidnapping, but also the horrors I experienced during the war, especially the deaths of Malad and the Dane. At the time of the story's writing, I was still trying desperately to rescue myself from myself, trying to understand the darkness in me that the war had unleashed and how to live with that. I really cared about that boy. He was sweet and charming until the war, and as all civil wars are capable of doing, hardened him into an angry killer roaming the streets of Damour with political leaflets and a Kalashnikov. As my caddy, he always made me laugh, especially at myself and my foibles on the golf course. He was so proud that his name meant Christmas. He says, I'm forever haunted that somehow I was unable to save him. The Dane, whom I only knew during the one faith ways. His philosophy has helped me to survive. I thought I'd share that with you. I was just gleaning this morning because I have hundreds of emails in dialogue between the two of us, sharing notes, and it was all part of the creative process that came into the creation of Eric Johnson's character, which George's admission was 75% of it's true, or 80% of it's based on his own true life experiences in Beirut at the time.
I'm sorry. I had mentioned in another interview how George had told me of an anecdote that he had when he guest starred on a TV show, I believe in the 80s, with Lorne Greene, when he had spent like a weekend worrying about a scene that he had to shoot. And when he got on the set that morning, he wanted to bring up that he thought the scene was not filmable for whatever reason. And he was sitting, I guess, in the makeup chair with Lorne Greene, famous from Bonanza and Battlestar Galactica. And then Greene turned to him and said, "So George, how are we going to do this scene?" And George felt like relief that he wasn't the only one that thought that the scene sucked. And so they got their heads together, they rewrote the scene, and whoever the director of that episode of that show was, after they had done it,
Right.
they said, I hope you didn't mind. We rewrote it. The guy was like, "No, we don't mind. I didn't even notice," and whatnot. I was wondering, did George ever relate those kind of any anecdotes like that, or was if you could say if that's sort of typical of George's working relationship with other people that you might have known of?
He was, that's again, it goes back to when we first met, when I did the 548. I mean, we just, the intelligence and the specificity that we had in our dialogue and discussion of character was always top on the list in our conversations. George was very much feel, and I agree 100%, is that you've got to be conflict in the scene, else you have no scene. And that bears back to the anecdote you're mentioning, where the director says, "I'm glad you guys figured it out, because the scene was just flat. There's just nothing. There's no arc in the scene, And George, felt that, and we were very careful in when he was writing the screenplay, that there was some conflict in a particular scene where one or the other character wants something, and what's preventing that character from getting it, to put it in simple terms. And I've had George come over to my class, my master's class, and he's given presentations Actually, this is funny. Here's an anecdote for you. He says, Dan, I'll be more than happy to speak to your master's class, but let me do it, and you'll see what's going to happen. Well, he appears as a homeless man in a tattered raincoat. And he walks in, and the students are saying, well, as I'm speaking, I'm interrupted by this homeless looking man, with a tattered raincoat. And he's asking, is this where the polling booth is? Because it was in November, by the way. And the kids say, no, it's not that. That's not the polling booth. He says, oh, yes, it is the polling booth. Of course it is. I know this. I was told this is the right address. Meanwhile, some of the students are getting quite disturbed, saying, what's going on here? And then George proceeds to go in the corner as if he's going to pull his pants to take a leak in the corner. And one student runs out to get security. And with that, George takes off his tattered raincoat and says, it's all illusion. It's all make-believe, And what's truth? And so that kicked off the lecture about truth and finding the conflict in scenes. But I'll never forget that. And he's repeated that performance at least 2 or 3 times in subsequent classes.
Did you ever find anything on any shoots that you did that I don't know what particular problems you might have had, but that George may have helped suggest something for you in any way?
Yeah, it goes back to there was a scene. It was, again, film is a collaborative process, so whoever gets the credit. I remember a scene with Stanley Tucci when I was doing a show called 3 Pounds. It was a short-lived show about a neurosurgeon. And Tucci's saying, I don't want to sit behind the desk here. And they got a 5-page scene here where this lawyer is threatening to sue me, and he's demanding that I not operate on his sister. I don't have his permission. And I recall, with the director, I was saying, well, yeah, it seems, and then Tucci came up with it. Together, it was a suggestion. What's the best way I could rebuff this character? And I need a physical act. I don't want to sit behind the desk, which makes the scene very static. Instead, I'll have my assistant, who's present in this exchange. His assistant neurosurgeon was there, and while this lawyer is venting, I'm going to walk away from my desk and go to the bookshelf. In other words, I'm going to take an action. And that's, in the film, is one of the primary good examples of, it's not through just words. It's also through a character's actions that we can reveal character and personality and motivations. And just with that act that Tucci decided to turn his back and go to the bookshelf is subtle but yet poignant emphasis on this person's disrespecting my space, so therefore I'm turning my back. My assistant can talk to him, and then after this lawyer has finished venting, he's going to turn around and then Tucci says, "Are you finished?" But I recall that, and my suggestion was that there needed to be a physical activity, and I recall that in our conversations years ago when I was doing the 548, was coming up with a visual grammar, coming up with giving an act or an action, a verb to work off. And that was very much an emphatic point that George, in our conversations with another, as far as, what helps him as an actor is coming up with an action. But again, step back, there's got to be a conflict, but then how am I going to express it through my action as well as the words?
Now, I never met George personally, but as I mentioned, I had about 12 years of contact with him via email, and probably 2 to 3 times a year via telephone conversations between 1 and 2 hours. So I probably had about 50 hours worth of conversations with him over the years. And I've been trying, as I've been doing the last couple of months, these interviews, trying to remember anecdotes myself. And I do remember that there was one thing that George always refused to talk about, and it was on the professional side, and it was, as I had mentioned before the interview, George had done a couple of what I would call sequelitis films. Psycho 2, I believe he was in, and also Death Wish 4, which I would assume he also had Charles Bronson in it. And I think it was Psycho 2, not Death Wish 4, but I could have it wrong. Maybe that George said it was the worst acting experience of his life, but he didn't want to go into it because I don't know whether it was because he felt ashamed or felt belittled or he didn't want to leave a black mark on his name. But now that he's no longer with us, I was wondering if he had ever related to you what which film it was, why it was such a horrible experience for him. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I'm trying to dust out the attic here in my mind to recall that anecdote. I remember it was on the dock in Santa Monica. He played a detective, and he was they were
Psycho 2?
arresting a fellow.
Was it Psycho 2?
Yeah, it could have been Psycho 2, but I exactly what the point there. I'm trying to recall, but I think it had to do more with it was just an expression, one word, one couple lines, rather than a full paragraph, and that was more expository as opposed to just saying something that subtextually. And that's another key thing that George emphasized was it's between the lines. It's not always what's on the surface. It's the subtext. And I think in that, I wish I can remember exactly what the line was for that scene, but it was an emphasis about subtext, and it took only but a few words and an expression in the eyes to get the point across. And speaking of eyes, I'll never forget from my film school, I had Nicholas Ray when he would come in and talk to us. And he always said one thing that always stayed with me. It reminds me of the Greek adage, the mirrors are the eyes are the mirrors to the soul. And he said, cinema, it's the melody is in the eyes. That's what Nicholas said. The melody is in the eyes. I'll never forget that. And even as a cinematographer and director, we communicate so much at times that it's not many words, but it could be just an expression, a look, that reveals something that's internal.
You've mentioned George in his film acting. I know that George had mentioned that I think he had written a few one-act plays, and I know he did stage in the 80s and the 90s as well. Did you ever get a chance to see him on stage? And can you talk maybe perhaps if you did any differences in terms of George as a stage dramatic actor and in the film television work?
I saw his one-man play years ago, about 30 years, 25 years ago here in New York.
And what was the name of that? Do you remember?
I can't recall it. It's in his book. It was a one-man show. I think it's in his book in the back. I'll have to go back to it.
Okay.
But anyway, George was not a method actor.
Yeah.
I mean, George is more akin to the British school of acting. It was. I remember forget. I don't care how you feel. It's more important how the audience feels.
Yeah, I remember him saying that on more than one occasion. Yeah.
And he was not. Yeah, he was definitely not a method person and had little patience for it. But he was. Yeah, that was the emphasis he would always say. It's not. I don't care what I feel. It's what the audience is going to feel in that moment. On stage, yeah, I could see he was a thinking man's actor. You could just feel the gears working. Not to say it reduced or minimized the feeling of spontaneity. Not at all. No. It's just that he had a totally different approach. It was more cerebral. It was he had very clear technical preparation in his work. But what I saw on stage was again it drew on the memories of his experiences during in the war and prior to that, and his different relationships.
Do you remember, because now that you mentioned the method acting thing, I remember George, this is maybe close to a decade ago, telling me an anecdote on one of the films he was working with a Hollywood actor who was a well-known method actor. I remember George was saying he was just sort of glad that he didn't share that many scenes with him, that it was a younger fellow at the time, and George was sort of just discuss it with the kind of prima donna-like thing. Do you remember? Did he ever mention that? I'm trying to think of which film it might have been. It wasn't Nicolas Cage. I'm trying to think who he might have been with, because I remember he had an anecdote where George went off and was exasperated about just how the director bent over backwards for the thing, and how he had George and the other actors had to sit around for 3 or 4 hours until this person got in the mood. And I know it was male, but I can't remember for the life of me what film or what actor. I was just wondering if you recalled.
I don't recall it, but you know, as a director, I can share the frustration, but it has to start with we both agree that the most important aspects in determining a successful film are the script and casting, and especially in casting, you may have a singularly wonderful actor, but you have to make sure that the chemistry is going to work. You know, one person. I mean, every actor has their own process. But you hope that, let's say, if it's Pacino or someone who is going to get it all in 3 takes, but the other actor that you cast, he needs 17 takes. You know, how do you now? I mean, do you go ahead and cast them, or in more cases than not, you may, but then you have to determine, you know, how are you going to prime them, like 2 thoroughbreds at the gate. You know, one's good in 3 takes and the other's good in 17. So that's a struggle. That's a battle. Let me just mention something real quickly about a note he made here. He said, John Le Carré devoted himself to describing betrayal, its terrible consequences, its relationship to love, and how the greater the love, the greater betrayal. If it was a test, we both failed, even though I knew all the answers beforehand. And then there is, of course, Die Lebensschlüge, the great lie we have to tell ourselves in order to be able to go on living with ourselves. The little lies are like body lice. Once you sense them on the other person, you can never really trust they've been gotten rid of forever. I truly hate the lies that are bullshit, a residue of my auto de fe in Beirut. Bullshit brings compromise that degrades the soul. There is no bullshit in my script.
Yeah, and I was just looking up on IMDb, and I remember the actor because I looked it up. It was After Dark, My Sweet, and Jason Patrick was the actor that was the prima donna that he was mentioning. And no offense, please don't sue me, Jason Patrick, but but I'm trying to remember what the anecdote was. But anyway, let me ask you this about the actor versus a writer, because I only saw George in let's see, the Blue Velvet, the After Dark, My Sweet, Psycho 2, and I think I might have seen Death Wish 4. I never really watched Hill Street Blues, and they were minor roles that weren't, you know, I don't think really showcased his acting ability so much. But I have read his stories, his poems, and the screenplay, and I'm wondering. Do you think that George was had a more natural bent as a writer because he had started out before he went into diplomacy, you know, as an editor at what was the magazine in the '60s that was sort of like a Playboy, what was it, Cavalier?
Cavalier.
Yeah, because I think that, and I remember he did send me one of his plays, and I think George, had he not had the writer's block, I think he could have really been a playwright. I think that was his natural métier. I think he had a good sense of character, a good sense of people, and a good dramatic sense. What is your take on him as a writer versus an actor?
Oh, I think George is a brilliant writer. Do you read Chico? His early short story?
In fact, it's on my website. Yeah, that and the man with butterflies is on my website.
Chico, for me, prestaged the Cuckoo's Nest in many ways, because it came out of that era, the 50s and early 60s, actually 50s. And it was based on his experiences when he was hospitalized when he was in the Army, just after the Korean War, I believe, or during that time. Yes, I again, you know, his collection of short stories and his marvelous, fantastic as a poet. I think when I was directing him, I remember my thesis film, it was a challenge for me, talking about keeping a balance on the set, where he would step out of character and we'd go into analysis about his character. And so I thought that was the writer in him that was stepping out of his character, and we would discuss, you know, the phrase, how it was written, or the structure, etc. You know, so I think I'm sure it was a conflict in him somewhat, you know, to leave that aside and immerse yourself into the character, because he was so like a great chess player. He was always 15 steps ahead, and also very knowledgeable about what echoes in the scene that's on hand to what happened before and what's going to happen later on in storytelling. So he was a brilliant and a natural storyteller. So, and his years of experience as an editor at Time, and as a short story writer, poet, wonderful. And then the acting came. If you listen, you've heard him, of course, recite his poetry. It's spellbinding. You know, he's just it's beautiful.
Yeah, I've actually done some poem videos with his wife Suzanne. I've got his CD actually in front of me here. The CD that you can see which
yes,
is
I have it as
so
well.
he's got 30-some poems. So over the next year or two, every few weeks, I'm going to be doing little poem videos to get his stuff out. His wife Suzanne, his widow, gave me permission to do that. But yeah.
But you know, George had a one hell of a sense of humor too. It was the black humor. I got to be frank with you. We would meet even when he could barely walk down those 72 steps. We would meet at the cafe. Come up. We have our table there, and oh, you know, I don't have much time left. You know, and that would start off the conversation. But it was in jest, and but at the same time, it was the reality, and he accepted his reality. But he did have a biting humor, and yeah, it's and again, but same time, I must say, what a big heart. A lot of humanity. I mean, just a warm heart. Apart from the fact that he could be so biting, and you had to watch cross your T's and dot your I's. He was very, very meticulous. I would say, even in my conversation, as close as we're very close friends. I was probably one of his closest friends. Was that he would remember exactly what you had said a year ago. And call back to the T to the sentence. So yeah, I always found, sometimes I had to catch myself, said, it's like right now, our sessions, he was recording it. And you had to really be careful, you know, be clear about what you were saying. And it led to disagreements and arguments we would have, because he would misinterpret what I said. But a brilliant, complex, wonderful, dear friend, who I miss.
Yeah, I remember many times calling him, and I too. I would call him no later than 11 o'clock Central Time. I'm in Texas, which would be midnight New York time, and he'd pick up, like, you know, he'd be real energetic. I say, "So how are you doing, George?" And he'd be oh, you know, my leg hurts, and he'd go on for 20 minutes or something. But then I talk about, you know, some movie, or a lot of times, at least once a year, when he was doing the Motion Picture Academy stuff and getting all the DVD stuff. You know, those would be some of the longest conversations that would go on 2 or 3 hours, and he'd talk about this, that, and that always seemed to energize him.
Yeah.
So let me let's. If you have any other final thoughts, let's just wrap up this conversation, or if you just want to add a final comment. And as I've said with some of George's other people, if you ever do get any other anecdotes, we can always do a follow-up interview, or as the film screenplay progresses, you know, if a year from now you got the green light, and we can talk about that. Is there any final thing, at least for this interview, that you'd like to add about the life and times of George Dickerson as you knew him?
Well, before I answer that, let me give you one more little bit here.
Okay, go ahead.
I thought was, this was when we were getting criticism from writers about the first act being too long, or the script being too long, etc. And George's response was, maybe we should just stop listening to what bothers people, including ourselves, and instead listen to all those who say it's a wonderful script. Maybe they don't realize that what bothers may be essential to what makes it seem wonderful in the long run. Tonight I was sitting here thinking about the first act again because you're still bothered by it, mentioning me, because I felt it was still a little long, and I thought about Michelangelo's sculpture of David. I have sat and studied that David in that church in Florence for 45 minutes at a time, pondering it from every angle. The bent right leg is much longer than the straight left leg, yet it gives the illusion of absolute proportionality. It only works because one leg is much longer than the other. And maybe my script is something absurdly magical like that. Maybe the first act just needs to be too long.
Well, that's the way it is with art too. There's always I've often said, and I remember saying this to George, that there's a difference, and speaking usually of poetry, there's a difference between a perfect poem and a great poem. I've written poems that I know that technically were great or were perfect or whatnot, but there wasn't any higher element. It was what it was, and it had great music. This one, but a great poem might have a flaw, but it reaches out at something. It reaches into you, and I think George understood the difference between perfection and greatness, and why greatness, as imperfect as it might be at times, is, in my opinion, and I know George shared this opinion, is the better thing. It's the higher thing, and it's the thing that people will look toward. They're not going to. People are often scared of perfection, but people are sort of, I think, drawn to greatness. People want to be great at something, whether it's just taking kids, being a good human being, whereas perfection scares them off. And I know George shared that opinion.
I add to that is that even as a cinematographer and director, I'm looking for what's the idea, mood, and emotion of each scene. And I think it was Levinson once said is, if the audience can remember one or two key scenes that affected them emotionally, then you'll be forgiven for the rest of the other scenes that are not up to snuff, so to speak. But the point is, those scenes, that emotion that the audience is feeling and expressing, that reminds us of our common humanity, then you've succeeded. And I think that's what we're talking about here.
It's like you can have the most dazzling camera work.
Right.
I mean, if you look at something like the films of John Cassavetes, I think is a perfect example. Sometimes, look at like a film. I'm sure you've seen a film like Faces. I mean, there are scenes in Faces, which I think was his first great film, and it goes on, and you look at like the end. There's a ragtag quality that I'm sure if you took it to film school, and they'd say, well, it goes on too long, the camera wanders a little bit, or what, but it gives that gritty reality that while it some people are going to nitpick it, it gets to you, and it's something different, and that's the kind of thing that works. And that's not to say that you can't have the dazzling visuals of an Orson Welles or Kubrick's Fanatic Control, but if that's not the only way to there are many paths to Nirvana kind of thing, and I think George was attracted to more of that Cassavetian's ideal. Myself.
Exactly. I agree that there's an emotional truth there, and but at the same time, we have to understand, particularly as directors and cinematographers, is the visual grammar. How are you going to express that? And what's so key is that having in your toolbox, understanding the subtleties, just as a writer has with punctuation, we have with camera placement, choice of lens, whether we move the camera or not move the camera, and lighting. We can say so many things. But it's all part of now interpreting from the written word into a visual grammar. Again, I point back to, what's the point of view here? What's the idea? What's the mood? And what's the emotion here that's going to propel and move the story forward? And George understood all that.
Well, any final comment, or do you want to just rest on that?
Other than George was a dear friend, a remarkable human being, and a great influence on my life. And I would, as that's to me defines a friendship where it's so mutually nourishing. And we just had such a wonderful exchange of, I said, the currency of ideas was always paramount in our discussions. And it was rich. It was a rich friendship. And I hope to carry on our promise to get this film produced, The Fool's Errand.
Okay, well, thank you, Dejan Georgevich, and over the coming weeks and months, I hope to have other friends and family members of George Dickerson speaking briefly or at length about their experiences. And Dejan, if you, you know, as I said, in the future, if there's any updates on the film and the progress, please let me know. And if you know of anyone else that George, any business associates or friends that might want to speak on his, you know, about him, don't hesitate to contact me. And thank you again.
It was a pleasure. Thanks.